Okay, this is an overview of Adam Smith excerpts um, from The Wealth of Nations, some excerpts from The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and some some excerpts from the Essays on Philosophical Subjects, um, the earliest of which being published in 1776, and then the last published in 1795. Okay, so I'm just going to go through, I annotated this myself. Hopefully you can read my handwriting. I'm not known for my penmanship, but hopefully this will be useful. Okay, so I'm just going to go through line by line, kind of give you my commentary. You should be adding to your annotations if you haven't already added them. Okay, so he begins, or at least we begin, with the excerpt which says, "The real price of everything, what everything really costs to the man who wants to acquire it, is the toil and trouble of acquiring it." Okay, so basically what he's doing is he's equating value to work hours. Keep this in mind when we talk about Karl Marx. He's going to have a kind of a similar, um, though more complex, definition for value. Okay, he then talks about monopoly, and he says monopoly is a great enemy to good management. People of the same trade seldom meet together, even for merriment and diversion. But the conversation ends in a conspiracy against the public or in some contrivance to raise prices. The monopolists, by keeping the market constantly understocked, by never fully supplying the effectual demand, sell their commodities much above the natural price. Okay, so the first part that's underlined there, where it says keeping the market constantly understocked, he's talking about disrupting the invisible hand. Okay, he hasn't mentioned the invisible hand yet, but that's essentially what he's talking about. And that natural price is again a reference to supply and demand equilibrium, which is achieved through the invisible hand. Okay, so he's very much against monopoly. In fact, his argument is that monopoly is probably one of the biggest threats to a free market because it disrupts competition. Right? Remember, competition is a problem because if you get rid of it, then there's no restriction on how much a company or a person can effectively charge for their product. Okay. So, for example, if I create a monopoly in bottled water, then I can charge $50 a bottle, and your only choice is whether to buy water or to not buy water. There's no choice to go to my competitor because I'm the monopoly and I am the only source. Okay, the next paragraph, where it says the uniform, constant, and uninterrupted effort of every man to better his condition. Okay, here he's talking about self interest. Okay? The principle from which public and national, as well as private opulence, is originally derived is frequently powerful enough to maintain the natural progress of things towards improvement. Okay? And here he's talking the natural progress of things towards improvement is part of the market mechanism. And then he goes on to say, in spite of both the extravagance of government, which has to do with taxing and spending, and the greatest errors of administration, which would be incompetence or inefficiency, like the unknown principle of animal life, it frequently restores health and vigor to the constitution, in spite not only of the disease, but of the absurd prescriptions of the doctor. This last sentence, like where it says, like the unknown principle, all the way to the end of the paragraph, is basically arguing that, okay, so when it says the unknown principle of animal life, he's basically referring to the fact that science really doesn't know a lot about animal anatomy and how it works, at least compared to today. So basically, when they see animal life become sick and then become healthy again, they're not sure how that's happening. They just see it happening. And in fact, what he's arguing is that in the economic sense, when things become bad and government intervenes when they don't really know why it's bad, then they actually create absurd prescriptions of the doctor, meaning the government puts out um, policies that they really don't know what the outcome is going to be, and they actually make it worse. Okay, so in essence, he's arguing in favor of letting the market figure itself out. Okay. So in the next paragraph where it says consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production. So consumption would be the buyers, right? The people buying the product or the demand. And all production is going to be the sellers or the supply. So consumption is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. Okay, so basically what he's arguing is that government should intervene in production only if that intervention is necessary for maintaining a competitive marketplace where consumers have access to all of the things they demand at reasonable payable prices determined by the invisible hand, supply and demand equilibrium. It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self or to their own interest. We address ourselves not to their humanity, but to their self-love. Okay, so he's talking about self-interest there, self-love. So he's saying we're not saying that they are producing things because they want to make the world a better place. They make those things in order to sell them to earn a profit to make themselves better off. But in doing that, we get a wide array of products, some of which are good, some of which are not good. The good ones persist and become integral to our life, and the bad ones go away. Okay? Every individual who employs capital, capital being resources devoted to production, and labors, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He is led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. So this entire little paragraph here is a description of Smith's idea of the invisible hand. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of society. So if you have already listened to the Google Slides on Adam Smith, you'll know that I use the example of Apple Computer and the iPhone. So I'll use it here again. So again, Apple Computer is not creating the iPhone to make the world a better place. Apple Computer is making the iPhone so that it can make billions and billions of dollars. In the end, some people might argue that it does make the world a better place. Some might argue that it makes the world not a better place. But ultimately, if you look at how the creation of the smartphone has changed the amount of information we have at our fingertips, I think you could make the argument that that's a good thing to a certain extent. But certainly, they weren't doing that because they said, "Wouldn't it be great for the world to have all of this information?" They said basically, hey, if we give them a product like this, are they willing to pay for it? Is it going to make improvements in their lives enough to where they want to pay for it? Okay, so the next paragraph says every man, as long as he does not violate the laws of justice, meaning fraud, theft, murder, etc., is left perfectly free to pursue his own interest his own way, and to bring both his industry, meaning his innovation, his ability to invent, to be intelligent, and his capital meaning wealth, into competition with those of any other man or order of men. Order of men would be a corporation or a business. Okay. Um, and then in the next paragraph, in the midst of all the expectations of government, capital. Okay. Again, here capital is specifically talking about wealth, but also resources devoted to production, has been silently and gradually accumulated by the private frugality, the savings, and good conduct of individuals. And here, good conduct is in reference to smart investments and business practices. Okay. By their universal, continual, and uninterrupted effort to better their own condition. Again, he's talking about self-interest. In this effort, protected by law, and so in this case, protected by law is in reference to property rights, so that if you produce something, someone can't just come and copy it and make it again, and sell it for a cheaper price. Okay, so we actually see this. In fact, the protection by law is one of the most important components of a capitalist system. if copyright law, for example, if I create a product, an iPhone, for example, and I get a patent or a copyright for that, patent being the same thing, um, someone else can't just copy what I'm making and sell it themselves without giving me some kind of compensation. Okay, so we see this play out interestingly between Apple and Samsung. They go back and forth suing each other, claiming that each one of them invented a certain uh, um, application or software piece that goes into the smartphone. And in some cases, Apple wins, and in some cases, Samsung wins. But the idea is that there's a law there to protect them, so that if they invest money and they take a risk, that there's a sufficient payout to continue to encourage taking those risks. Okay. So it is this effort protected by law and allowed by liberty, meaning economic freedom, to exert itself in the manner that is most advantageous, which has maintained the progress of England towards opulence and improvement in almost all former times. Okay. Interestingly, he mentions England here, but at the time, the American colonies had the highest standard of living in the entire world. Um, and also not interesting, or interestingly, they also had the loosest government regulations. Okay, so the capitalist system by accident was almost allowed to flourish, or not almost, but was allowed to flourish in the colonies in ways that in the home country it was not. Okay. It is the highest impertinence and presumption, therefore, in kings and ministers. So if you think back to chapters 1 and 2 in Heilbronner's The Worldly Philosophers, he talks about command and tradition. And so he's talking about kings being command, and ministers would probably be, well, I guess ministers are command as well, to prevent watch over the economy of private people and to restrain their expense. Okay. In They're themselves always and without exception the greatest spendthrifts in the society. So basically, they're saying kings and dictators are usually the worst. Okay, they're the ones who are the most wasteful and inefficient, in part because they're not bound by the marketplace. They're not bound by competition. Okay, so they can spend and spend and spend, and they don't care whether the money itself is actually accomplishing the task. They just throw more money at it. Okay, we move on to the second page. It continues. Let them look well after their own expense, and they may safely trust private people with theirs. If their own extravagance does not ruin the state, that of their subjects never will. So basically, what they're saying is, if they pay it to, if a ruler, a king, or a dictator focuses on their own spending, okay, and make sure that that does not destroy the state, then and they allow their subjects to do the same, then they won't have anything to worry about. Okay, so because everybody will be operating under their own best interest. Okay, great nations are never impoverished by private. And in this case, private is referring to the market, though they sometimes are by public prodigality. Okay, public would be government spending. Prodigality would be wasteful. So public prodigality and misconduct. Misconduct could be things like embezzling money from the government, somehow siphoning off resources. The whole or almost the whole public revenue, which is taxes, is in most countries employed in maintaining unproductive hands. Okay, so basically he's saying that we tax people too much, okay, or they were taxing people too much, kings, and that most of the extra tax money, when it wasn't being spent on society, was actually going into the coffers of these rulers and other people who are not working. Okay, so a king doesn't really do anything in society other than put down the rules. They don't produce anything typically, and so they are unproductive. Such people, as they themselves produce nothing, are all maintained by the produce of other men's labor. In other words, a king only exists because they're able to collect taxes off of the work of other people. Okay, those unproductive hands, who should be maintained by a part only of their spare revenue of the people, spare revenue being the extra tax dollars, may consume so great a share of their whole revenue, and thereby oblige so great a number to encroach upon their capitals, upon the funds destined for the maintenance of productive labor, that all the frugality and good conduct of individuals may not be able to compensate the waste and degradation of produce occasioned by this violent and forced encroachment. Essentially, what he's saying there is that if you look historically at kingdoms that overtaxed their populations, it all led to their downfall because people spent all of their time working in order to be able to pay an exorbitant tax rather than actually producing something that would benefit themselves. Okay. Little else is required to carry a state to the highest degree of opulence or wealth from the lowest barbarism, but peace, which is defense, easy taxes, okay, low, easy being low, relatively low, and tolerable administration of justice, which includes, protecting against theft and murder and fraud and maybe some contract enforcement, and then providing minimal regulation for the marketplace. According to the system of natural liberty, the sovereign, which is the ruler or government, has only three duties. Okay. First, the duty of protecting society from violence and invasion and other independent societies, which is defense. Okay. Secondly, the duty of protecting, so far as possible, every member of society from the injustice or oppression of every other member of it. Okay. Or the duty of establishing exact administration of justice. So this is you have a process of laying out the laws in terms of murder and theft and fraud and contract enforcement. And then you also have a series of punishments that are known by everyone. Okay. And then thirdly, the duty of erecting and maintaining certain public works and certain public institutions, which it can never be for the interest of any individual or small number of individuals to erect and maintain. So there's certain things where the marketplace is going to not provide because it's not in anyone's benefit to actually maintain them. For example, a public education system or universal health care. These are things that in the study of economics, we would refer to them as externalities, which means in the normal course of a free market, they're not going to be provided free public education or free universal health care are not going to be provided to the population because it's in no individual person's benefit to do that, even though it may be in the benefit of the entire society to have a educated population or a healthy population. Okay. So with the greater part of the rich people, the chief enjoyment of riches consists in the parade of riches. Okay. Parade of riches is the expensive goods that they own. Okay. Which in their eyes is never so complete as when they appear to possess those decisive marks of opulence which nobody can possess but themselves. So really, historically, we're talking about large houses, we're talking about clothing, we're talking about jewelry. Today, we'd be talking about expensive cars, mansions, designer clothes, those things that you pay. You buy that handbag that costs $500,000, and you're really just paying for that logo so that everyone else knows that you have a Gucci bag. Okay. That wealth and greatness are often regarded with the respect and admiration which are due only to wisdom and virtue. Okay. And that the contempt of which vice and folly are the only proper objects is often unjustly bestowed upon poverty and weakness. So essentially what he's saying is that society basically looks at wealth and thinks that that is equivalent to wisdom and virtue, so we should revere it, and that poverty should be seen with contempt. Okay? That poverty is treated often like a vice, like a vice being like drug use or alcoholism. So poverty is seen kind of in the same way. Has been the complaint of moralists in all ages. What improves the circumstance of the greater part can never be regarded as an inconveniency to the whole. Okay, so what improves the circumstances of the greater? Are we talking about welfare? Maybe. Are we talking about universal health care? I would think so. We might even argue that using taxes to engage in some kind of relatively mild redistribution of wealth might also fit into what he's talking about here. Okay, no society can surely be flourishing and happy of which the far greater part of the members are poor and miserable. So if you have a population where the majority are in poverty, then you can't say it's a flourishing society. And so creating a redistribution of wealth, creating some kind of welfare system, creating things like public education and universal health care, those things might actually be things that Smith would argue would be in uh, um, help the society flourish and be happy. Okay, and then the last paragraph, the subjects of every state ought to contribute towards the support of the government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective abilities. Okay. Interestingly, people who cite Adam Smith today tend to be those on the libertarian or conservative side, and they often talk about Smith as limited government and cutting taxes um, and almost extreme free market. And I always ask when I talk to people like that, hey, what do you think about what Smith says about the progressive tax code? And most of the time, that's how you can figure out that they've never actually read Adam Smith. Um, but here, Adam Smith is actually supporting pretty clearly progressive tax codes. So he says that in proportion to their respective abilities, and then he talks about the necessaries of life occasion the great expense of the poor. Necessities of life or necessaries of life would include things like food and shelter. Today, we would think of them things like toothpaste and toilet paper and those kinds of things that everyone has to buy. Okay, the luxuries and vanities of life occasion the principal expense of the rich. So luxuries and vanities would be things that are beyond the necessities, beyond food and shelter. And I would direct you back to the discussion above on large houses and clothes. And today we would think about BMWs and extravagant cars. Um, so the luxuries and vanities of life occasion the principal expense of the rich, and the magnificent house embellishes and sets off to the best advantage all other luxuries and vanities which they possess. A tax upon house rents, therefore, would in general fall heaviest upon the rich. So house rents would be basically property taxes. So if your house is worth more, then you have to pay more taxes. And in this sort of inequality, there would not perhaps be anything very unreasonable. It is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense, not only in proportion to their revenue, but something more than that proportion. So, a progressive tax code basically, and this is what he's talking about, says that as um, your the proportion of your income that you pay for income taxes increases as your income increases. So the first $10,000 is 0%. The next $10,000 is 5%. The next $10,000 is 10%. Those numbers are not really any accurate. I'm just using those as placeholders. But the idea is as you earn more money, you pay a larger chunk of that more money in taxes. Okay, so that's the end of our discussion of Adam Smith close reading excerpts. Hopefully, this was helpful to you. And I will see you the next time I see you. Have a good one. Stay safe. Wash your hands.